In this video, we're going to continue our discussion on SQL PSM. So how do we handle missing data in our database? Well, there are several things we could do. We could substitute an estimate of the missing value using some kind of formula. We could construct a report of the missing values, or we could just ignore the missing data unless the value is significant. So using sensitivity testing. Now, something that can help us with handling missing data is a trigger. So triggers can be used to perform many of these operations, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So as we are writing SQL PSM, sometimes we'll come across errors that might occur in our SQL PSM. So how do we handle these errors? We use what is called signal SQL state. So we're going to use an arbitrary number of 45,000. So we'll say signal SQL state of 45,000. There are default numbers that are associated with MySQL error messages. So 45,000 is outside this range and is perfectly acceptable to use. Then we can set message text equal to our error message that we want to display. If we want to continue, even if some errors do occur, we can declare a continue handler. So we can say declare continue handler for SQL state 2000. So if error message 2000 happens, we can set an end indicator equals 1, and then we could check to see if the end indicator is set and then continue or do something else. So we mentioned triggers, which is the next routine as part of SQL PSM. Now let's talk about what triggers are. Triggers are routines that are invoked automatically when a change is made to the data on an associate table. It's called by an event. So for example, if an insert, update, or delete occurs against a specific table that has a trigger on it, that trigger will then be run. So the syntax for a trigger is similar to the syntax for a procedure and function. We're going to still change the delimiter using delimiter $, and at the end we'll change the delimiter back. And then we still have the begin and end logic. What's different is the create trigger portion. So we're going to say create trigger, the name of the trigger. So there's 6 types of triggers. There's the before insert, update, or delete, or there's the after insert, update, or delete. So we're going to say one of those. So for example, before insert on a specific table. And then if more than one row is impacted by this query, such as I delete multiple rows, or I update multiple rows, or I insert multiple rows into a table, we're going to want to use for each row if more than one row is impacted, unless we only want to run this trigger for the first row. If there are multiple triggers that would execute based on something that happens against the database, we could then use follows or precedes an existing trigger name. This would allow me to run it after or before another trigger. So let's look at a trigger example. If I wanted you to create a trigger that checks whether the order date entered is not today, we could start by saying delimiter $. We would then create the trigger called check date that is going to happen before insert, because before the data goes into the database, I want to know if the data is not today. So we're going to say before insert on the order table, and then for each row that we are inserting, and then we're going to begin and end our code. Inside of the begin and end, I'm going to say if new.order date does not equal the current date, then we will display an error message. So we will use signal SQL state 45,000. We'll set the message text equal to trigger error, the order date has to be today. So you'll notice here that we have the command of new. New is basically when I'm inserting any data that is going into the database or being changed to a new value in the database. There's also a keyword of old. Old is anything that currently exists in the database. So old will be run with delete and update, and new will be on insert and update. So in order to test the trigger, we're going to run something that's going to violate or break the rules that are found within the trigger. So I'm going to say insert into order, and then I specify the columns that I'm going to insert into. So customer ID, order date, fulfillment date, salesperson ID, and ship address ID, and then the values for each one of these columns. So I've gone ahead and copied these over, so I'm going to run this trigger to create it, and it says that it was successfully created. Let's go to the Tables tab, and specifically let's go to the Order table where we created this trigger, and you'll notice now that there is a Triggers tab. If I click on this, similar to the other routines we've created, if I click on the routine itself, I can see the code that was used to generate that statement. So let's go ahead and test our trigger by running the second query. So as you can see, the order date is not today, so we get the error message that we had in our actual trigger that says trigger error, the order date has to be today. So now I want you to attempt a few of these triggers on your own. So try these 3 queries on your own, pause this video, and then come back to compare your answers. Welcome back. I have copied and commented out each one of these questions, so let's go ahead and address this first one, which asks us to create a trigger called customer exists trigger that checks to see if a new customer already exists, and then display an error if the customer already exists. So in order to do this, we're going to start by changing our delimiter to $, and then we'll go ahead and reset the delimiter back to semicolon. Then we go ahead and create our trigger, and we'll name it customer exists trigger, and then we're going to check to see if a new customer already exists. So before the customer is in inserted, we want to know if they already exist so that we can display the message. So this is going to be a before trigger, specifically an insert trigger. So before insert on the customer table, and then we want this to happen for each row. Then we're going to begin and end with our $2 signs. And inside of here, we're going to check to see if that customer already exists. So in order to see if a customer exists, we're going to just check their name. There could be a customer with the same name, but for demonstration purposes, let's just assume that every customer is going to have a different name because these are business customers, not actual individuals. So in order to do that, I'm going to do an if then end logic. So if a condition, then we will run something, and then we'll end if. It's always a good idea to do your end if when you do your if so you don't forget that. So what is our condition we're going to check for? We're going to check to see if the number of customers, so I'm going to count the customers or rows from the customer table where the name of the customer equals the name of the customer that's being inserted into, so the new.name, and I'm going to see where that is greater than 0. So if the count of a customer is greater than 0, that means the customer exists, then we'll do something. Otherwise, it will just ignore this and let the insert naturally take place. So what is this that we're going to do? Well, we're going to signal an error message. So I'm going to go up here and copy this and paste it, and this is the error message. So we're going to say signal SQL state 45,000 set message text equal to, and this time we're going to say trigger error, the customer already exists. So let's go ahead and run this query. We see that the trigger was successfully executed. Now let's go ahead and test this query. So I'm going to insert into the customer table, and then let's go see which fields are required. And we can see that the only required field is the customer ID. So I'm just going to insert a name. So we'll go ahead and insert the name column and then values. We know that Contemporary Casuals is a customer in our database. So let's go ahead and run this, and we see the error message from our trigger saying the customer already exists. Okay, so let's go to this next query, which asks us to create a trigger called valid price insert trigger, and then another trigger called valid price update trigger that ensures that the price of all products is greater than 0, and then we're asked to display an error message if the price is not greater than 0. This is on both inserting and updating. So if I add a new product and it has a price that is 0 or less, or I update a product's price and it has a price of 0 or less, then we want to display an error message. So I'm going to begin by saying delimiter $$, and then we'll restore our delimiter back to the semicolon. Then we will create our trigger. So create trigger, and this first one is going to be valid price insert trigger. So I'm going to say before insert on, and the table that we're interested in inserting the price into would be the product table. And then we're going to say for each row, because we could insert multiple rows in one statement, and then we will begin our logic. So begin, and then we got to remember to end it. So we'll put $$ after end. So this query is going to check to see if the price of the new product that's going in is greater than 0. So we're going to say if new.price, so the price that is going into the product table, is less than or equal to 0, then we will throw an error message. So make sure that we have the end if closed as well. I'm going to go ahead and just copy this error message line again and paste it between this if and end if. And this time our trigger error is going to say price of the newly inserted product must be greater than 0. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this, and it says the trigger is successfully executed. I'm going to copy this because now we're going to do the same thing for an update trigger. So this one will say create trigger valid price update trigger, and rather than before insert on product, now we are going to check for updates on product, and then for each row, because multiple values could be updated, then we're going to check to see if the new price again is less than or equal to 0. We would say the price of a product must be greater than 0. So let's go ahead and run this query. All right, so let's go ahead and test these queries now. So I'm going to go to the tables and see which fields are required in the product table. And the only thing that's required is the product ID. So I'll go ahead and insert a product with a price of 0. So we'll say insert into product and then price. I don't need to include the product ID because it auto increments. And then I'll say values of 0. And let's go ahead and run this query. And we get our trigger message saying the price of the newly inserted product must be greater than 0. So now let's go ahead and do the same thing for update. So I'm going to update product, and I'm going to set the price of all products equal to 0 and run this, and it says the price of the product must be greater than 0. So we can see that both these triggers have prevented these inserts and updates from happening against the database. All right, so for the next query, we're asked to create a trigger called the shipping trigger that when a new customer is inserted, a new record will also be inserted into the customer shipping address table with the same values, assuming that the territory ID is 5. So let's go to our ERD, and we're interested in customer and shipping address. So essentially essentially what we're trying to do is take the customer ID, the street, city, state, and zip code, and use the customer ID here, the street, city, state, and zip code. We won't include the directions because it's optional. And then the territory that we're going to use is number 5. So we'll go ahead and start this trigger by specifying the change in the delimiter, and then we will go ahead and change this back. And then we'll create our trigger called shipping trigger. And this time we want to insert the newly inserted customer into the shipping address table. So we want the insert to happen first. So we're going to do an after insert on the customer table. And then this should be for each row. And then we will begin and end our code with $. And between the begin and the end, after it's inserted that customer, we are going to then insert into the shipping address table. So we'll say insert into shipping address. And the columns that I'm going to insert are customer ID, territory ID, ship street, ship city, ship state, and ship zip code. And again, the ship directions we're going to leave blank. And then for the values, I'm going to use the new customer ID, 5 for the territory ID, the new street that's been inserted into the customer, the new city, the new state, and the new zip code. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And it says the trigger was successfully executed. So let's go ahead and test this now by inserting a new customer. So we'll say insert into customer, a name, a street, a city, a state, and a zip code. And for the values, the name is going to be Blue Jay Inc. Street is 2500 California Plaza. City is Omaha. State is Nebraska. And zip code is 68178. We're going to go ahead and run this. It says that the query is successfully executed and 1 row was affected. If I go to my tables, specifically the customer table, we will now see that there is a new customer named Blue Jay Inc. And then if I go to the shipping address table and go to the table data, we will see that the customer information has been transferred over here as well, and that this is the territory of 5 and 17 corresponds to the new customer that was inserted previously.